I was not right, I did not feel good at all. My thoughts were tainted, I almost felt delusional. I stared at her insides as the screaming around me continued. Everything was blank. There were no thoughts in my head. Ashton? My dear, we must be mistaken. Ashton? I got up from where I was sitting and looked up into the tree, trying to find any sign of her. Another huge gust of wind blew aggressively by me. Any tears I had still on my face had frozen to my skin. It could have easily been -10 degrees, but I no longer felt cold. I couldn't feel much at all. I could not stay here. Every ounce of me wants to climb that tree and find whatever took her from me. But I am truly exhausted and I have no energy left in me. I have concluded that at the next opportunity, I am going to end my life. But I have given up, and I do not have any hope left. I do not care about finding a way out. I do not care about finding answers for a Willow Creek. I do not care about ending my bloodline or ridding the stain or hex that had been placed on my family. I do not care anymore. It is time for me to go. If I take my life and wind up in hell with my father, then fuck it. Maybe it is what I deserve. Maybe that's what was meant to happen from the start. My thoughts are a puzzle. My thoughts are toxic and nowhere close to healthy. My body is exhausted, and I don't think I have any more fight in me. I walked and I walked. Over hills, over summits. I just followed the path, trying to find that opportunity. I just needed the right place and moment to do so. I walked for miles through the forest, guided only by a flashlight in the pitch dark, through extremely heavy weather. The trees began to appear taller. The branches reached across the trail. I managed to find a hollowed-out portion of the trees. The branches here overlapped each other, providing an umbrella effect over where I was. I figured it would be best to stop here and rest for a little while. I did not feel threatened here. I did not feel the need to keep following the path right now. I could still see the trail from where I was in the tree break. I rolled a few large logs over to the center. I put my backpack against a tree and started rolling large rocks over to the logs. I was able to make a fire pit with a place to sit. I took the small hatchet from my backpack and started to cut up small dead sticks and branches on the ground. When that was done, I did my best to clear the surrounding dirt of snow and debris. If by chance I fell asleep, I wanted the ground to be dry around the fire. It took me about an hour, but with some effort, I managed to build a pretty good-sized fire. I sat on one of the logs and cooked my canned food as I read through Blanca's journal again and again. I brought out the watch and placed it on the log next to me. The time read, 10:07. December 25th. It was as if time got even slower the further I descended. The watch says only 4 hours have passed when I have been down here for what I feel is at least 2.5 to 3 days. At this rate, it would take me 2 more days until it turned to December 26th. Right now the ambience, the sky looked as if it were to be around 10 p.m. That is probably the more eerie thing about it. No matter how many times or how hard I tried to make sense of time down here, the more confused I get. But when I have been in open spaces like this, it is night. There are no stars, there is no moon. There are no clouds, but there is fog and there is snow. There is wind and there is a darkness that feels just like a night in an outdoor setting. Except we are not outside. I am many miles underground. Where there is no wind, there is no light, no ambient sounds. Just silence when the wind is not present. The type of quiet that is more disturbing than peaceful. The type of silence that pits your stomach like never before. When there is no wind, it is just silent. It does not make sense that time is this slow, but it almost feels as if it is on purpose. I got up and gathered some more wood. I then cooked the last of my canned food before I untied the sleeping bag from my backpack. I unrolled it and set it up on a dry patch of dirt and pine leaves next to the fire. I read Blanca's journal once more before I climbed into my sleeping bag. My face toward the fire while also facing the opening to the trail, mine hatched by my chest. My back facing the tree line behind me. Although there is no animal life down here, there is a constant feeling of being watched. After putting Blanca's journal down, I looked ahead at the fire until I eventually began falling asleep. I woke up with my hatchet between my arms, pressed against my chest. The fire was still going strong. I looked at the watch that sat beside my head. The time read 10:43 p.m. It felt like I have slept for hours and hours. Now that I have gotten some rest, my thoughts were a lot more clear, which also meant everything felt that much more real and raw. I had to remind myself a few times of where I was and the situation I was in. The pain gradually sank in that everyone was gone. Everyone was dead. I cried on and off for a long time by that fire. The snow was falling harder. After a few silent moments, I began to hear footsteps from the distance. I got up from my sleeping bag and put on my boots as quickly as I could. I grabbed my hatchet and sat on the log by the fire. I was not trying to run, I was not trying to fight. I just want it to pass. Whatever it is, I just want it to pass. Through the trees I could see the flame floating along the path. I could make out a few very tall dark-robed figures. One in front of the flame, and one behind the flame. I sat quietly as I watched the figures slowly approach the entrance. The flame passed by as well as one of the large robed figures. One stopped in an entranceway to where I was resting. It stood there for what felt like a minute. Its robe is black. The hood of the robe created an abyss that hid any features. You could not see its face. It stood at least 10 feet tall and did not have feet. At times it looked as if it were levitating above the ground. The flame continued down the path accompanied by the other robed figure. The glow faintly disappeared into the trees. The figure in the doorway slowly made its way into the hollowed space and over towards me. I sat frozen as I watched the figure sitting on the log across from me. The fire grew a little taller, the wind calmed down to a low howl.
"Forrest,"
the figure said aloud.
"it is a shame to see you here at a time like this."
He added. "Who are you? What are you?" I asked, trying to see its face.
"Your questions will be answered over time, young one. But I will tell you that I am the second king of the Northridge Mountains. I know you very well, my friend."
There was a pause before he began again.
"You, Forrest, have found yourself in an interesting position,"
the figure stated. "How so?" I asked.
"You have a choice. I want to give you the outcome. You can end the stain on your bloodline, you can bring closure to Willow Creek, and you can cleanse yourself and your spirit of your damning portrait. You would just have to follow me. The other choice you have is to wait here in the weather until that watch you have eventually reached midnight. If you keep traveling this path after that, you will find yourself a way out of the corridors. You will live a life full of guilt, a life full of emptiness, a life alone and absent of love. Your spirit, your being will never be in the company of the ones you love ever again. You know exactly what I am talking about, Forrest. If there is one moment I need you to listen, it is now,"
the figure said. I sat on the log trying to understand what exactly was going on. I felt threatened by the large figure, but I also felt a sense of comfort. We sat in silence as the wind passed by us. I lit a cigarette and took a swig from the flask. "I will go with you," I said, breaking the silence.
"Are you sure, Forrest?"
the voice asked aloud. "Yes, I am sure. I will continue," I added as I rolled up my sleeping bag before tying it to my pack. I put the hatchet back in my pack and brought out the large Ziploc bag I took from Jake's backpack. "I am going to take my time." "You must know I will take my time," I said sarcastically, trying to copy the way the figure spoke as I brought out the pipe and the weed. To be completely fair, I sound calm. I am terrified. My insides are turning every time I look over at the figure. In a way, I was desperate to calm my nerves. If that meant smoking, then fine. What else is there to lose at this point?
"That is fine, Forrest. We will leave here when you are ready. Listen, little one. You have given up. You need to think of everything you have been fighting for. Your story is long from over, my friend. There are things you have yet to experience. There are still so many things for you to see. We both know you are stronger than what you tell yourself. Don't give up on yourself just yet. You will see there is still a lot left fighting for, my Tanya,"
the figure said aloud. "Wait? What the fuck did you just say?" I said as I looked over at the figure. There was no answer. The figure stood up from the log and started towards the entrance to the pathway. I stood up and put on my backpack. "That last part, say it again," I said as I started to follow the robed figure to the pathway. I was truly at a loss for words. I had so many questions. It is a dead language. There has to be a reason these figures are speaking Kilpoko. We walked through the trees for miles. I followed the robed figure over hills, through tunnels, over frozen lakes, through deep snow, High winds, negative temperatures, and blizzard-like conditions. There was no conversation, there was no interaction. The figure stayed around 50 feet in front of me. I did my best to keep my pace. We eventually reached another narrow path through a dense portion of the forest. The figure was moving slower than before. After a few moments, I was able to catch up with it. The figure turned to me and said, "You must rest for now, my boy. I have something for you ahead." Confused, I stood in silence looking around for anything familiar. After another gust of wind, a large white owl flew over us to land on a branch about 10 feet away. Shortly after, the glow from the levitating flame could be seen drifting towards us. It had stopped a few hundred feet away. You are in the company of many others, my Kaitanya. Do not think of them, do not try to see them. They are not what you think. The robed figure said as it stood before me. I walked over to a log along the path. I took off my backpack, grabbing cigarettes, the flask, and the weed pipe. My legs were throbbing. I have been walking for days now. The time on the watch read 11:03 p.m. Nothing felt real, nothing felt normal. I'm sure my brain has been traumatized to the point where I have accepted all of this. Every abnormality seemed to be unquestioned. I looked around to see the other tall robed figure a few hundred feet in front of us. It was almost as if one robed figure was leading the front, while the flame followed behind with me, the owl, and the other robed figure in the center. Even if I wanted to run from this, something tells me I wouldn't be able to. My mind was numb. I was not scared, I was not worried. I took a long swig from the flask. When I pulled it from my lips, I saw my reflection in the flask for the first time. My face, my clothes, my skin covered in blood. Most of it was dry, a lot of it was not. None of this blood was my blood. I loaded the pipe with some weed and took a few large hits before getting off the log. I built a small fire and sat at the log for a while as I let my legs and mind rest. The horns sounded in the distance as the wind howled through the trees. Around 30 minutes passed before I stood up to walk again. Without a word, the figure and the owl started down the path again. We walked for about 10 more minutes before we reached a more dense, narrow part of the trail. The tall figure called to me. "We will stop here for now, my friend. The ones that are traveling with us will stop now as well. My friend, I have something for you. Something you have dreamed of having the opportunity to pursue. You said you choose to follow me. This will show that you mean what you say. Forest, you need to rid yourself of any stain that you carry before we continue down this path. You will understand as to why soon enough. You will do this not only for yourself but for countless others. Through those trees are the ending to many stories. The ending to a variety of innocent suffering. My boy, you must make your way through those trees. Everything will become clear once you make your way through those trees," the figure said while facing the tree line to the right of the trail. It was silent for a few moments. The wind blew by my face once more before I started walking toward the break in the trees. I followed the narrow path for a few hundred feet before the path opened up to a large open meadow-like plot of land. The snow was falling very hard, the wind was strong. It was almost pitch dark except for a very faint glow from the distance. This was not like the flame glow we keep seeing. This glow was stronger and partially illuminated the snow around it. I struggled to walk through the weather, legs sinking deeper and deeper into the snow. My flashlight did not work, the flame from my Zippo did not work. The only light I had to follow was the faint yellow light ahead of me. I was eager to get to it. There was a fire in my gut that kept me wanting to reach the glow. I walked until I got to a distance where I could make out a small structure. The glow was coming from the window. It was the shack. The one Mr. Bringston, my father, built. I was in the Bringstons' backyard. Hatred, disgust, violence continuously filled my head as I walked over to it. The light flickered as if someone was moving inside. As I approached, the faint sound of old music could be heard from the open window. Through the window you could see crosses nailed to every open space on the inner walls of the shack. A few candles were lit. Mr. Bringston sat naked with his back against the wall. He looked weathered and as if he has been awake for days. He looked terrified. He looked helpless and miserable. The longer I looked at him, the more hate filled my thoughts. I walked around to the front of the shack. The door was not locked. I walked inside the shack and shut the door behind me. I walked over to him slowly. I stood 10 feet from him. I wanted to get a good look at his face. He refused to make eye contact. He closed his eyes as he began to tremble. I calmly walked over to the desk and grabbed the wooden chair that sat by it and brought it over to where he was sitting, his back against the bed behind him. I sat in the chair facing Mr. Bringston, waiting for him to look up at me. "Look at me," I said calmly. The man continued to shut his eyes as his body shook. I got up from the chair, walked over to him, and kicked him as hard as I could in the mouth. My steel-toed boots ripping open his upper and bottom lip. A few teeth fell on the floor. The man began to cry. "If you are not going to look at me, then you are going to listen," I said before sitting back down in the chair. "You sir are a sad, pathetic little fuck. You are weak, you are nothing. Do you think it's cool to fuck little kids, Mr. Brixton? Huh, do you? You think it is okay to escape your consequences then pawn them on others? You knew damn well what you were doing, Mr. Brixton. So sad, so guilty, so weak, so pathetic. The night you made the deal with the below was the night you promised the lives of your family and bloodline. You did not make a promise to God, you made a promise to the first great king of hell, you fucking idiot. Mr. Brixton, you promised the below the life of others, lives that did not belong to you. For nothing else but your own sick, fucked up benefit. You are no better than the bishop, you are no better than the dirt I walk on," I said as I lit a cigarette. Mr. Brixton began to cry harder and harder. "You thought taking your life would end all this? You thought death would pay your debt? Mr. Brixton, it did not. You ran from the below, you did not keep your end of the promise. This is far from over, you sick fuck. You were misled once again. Such a shame, man. All these people believing in something that does not believe in them," I said as I sat back and took a swig from the flask. "What made you think you were special? I would really like to know. How could you be so fucking stupid, Mr. B? Before the below got to you, you willingly became that vengeful spirit's bitch, didn't you? And then, you made your kidnapping and child molestation a routine, didn't you? But it wasn't all that spirit, was it? This is who you were, Mr. Brixton. Long after the below damned that vengeful spirit, you continued to fuck little kids. Including your own first child. Before you sent him to the bishop. Jacob? Remember him?" I said before flicking the butt of my cigarette at his face. He cried and cried. Sobbing, wailing. He did not try to run, he did not try to leave. He bled from his mouth and onto his stomach. I took another swig from the flask. "You handed a helpless boy to the hands of fucking monster. A monster just like you but with power," I said calmly. Mr. Brixton begged and pleaded for forgiveness. He prayed for God, he helplessly wailed for the heavens to save his soul. God abandoned all of us a long time ago, Mr. Brixton, he is not going to answer you. You should know this by now, I said as I got up from my chair and brought it back over to the desk. I then pushed the chair into the desk slowly and walked over to Mr. Brixton. I kicked him as hard as I could in the mouth again. More teeth fell onto the floor. The man picked his head up and looked into my eyes for the first time. "Who are you?" he asked as blood leaked from his mouth. "I am your son," I responded as I walked over to his feet. I grabbed Mr. Brixton by the legs and dragged him out of the shack and into the snow. He begged for mercy as I reached into my backpack to grab my flashlight. I beat his head over and over until he was unconscious. I got up and walked over to one of many large jagged rocks that sat next to the shack. I picked one up and walked back over to him. I struck his face as hard as I could, over and over and over again. I ripped the nose off his face, I broke every tooth in his mouth, I ripped his jaw off the hinges. I tore his eyes out. I beat his face and his skull with the rock until he was unrecognizable. Brain tissue spilled onto the snow beside him. I began striking his collarbones and chest with the rock. I broke every rib, I shattered every bone in his arms and his legs. His limbs looked like they had been run over repeatedly by a large vehicle. I got up and walked into the shack. The large glass jar of pills sat open next to the lamp. I smashed the jar on the floor, glass and pills were everywhere. I found the largest and sharpest piece I could find and walked back outside over to the body. I sank the glass into his throat and dragged it to the base of his stomach. Stabbed his chest and gut as much as I could before his inside spilled into the snow. After the stomach, I moved to his chest. "You like that? You sick fuck. Fucking waste. You disgusting piece of shit." My hand began to bleed from the piece of glass slicing my flesh every time it'd strike his body. I stood up and looked down at his lifeless mangled corpse. I went back into my backpack to grab the hatchet. I walked back over to the shack to grab another rock. I sat by his corpse and sharpened the hatchet as best as I possibly could with a rock. I stood up from my seat and walked over to the body. I spent every ounce of energy I had chopping and cutting his body into pieces. First, I separated what was left of his head from his torso. I then removed his arms and legs before separating his hands, his feet, and his genitals. I then got up and walked back over to the shack. I found a lighter next to the candles on the desk by the bed. The music began blaring as I lit the blankets and curtains on fire. The pillows quickly were consumed by the flame. I threw the wooden desk chair on top of the mattress. It didn't take long for the ceiling to catch fire. I walked out of the shack and over to space to watch the shack burn. I lit another cigarette as the walls of the small structure caved in. I was covered in fluids, I smelt of iron and bile. I finished my cigarette and grabbed my backpack before finding my tracks in the snow to lead me back to the trail through the trees. Once I got to the pathway, I could not see any of the figures from before. I was alone. I was more numb than before, but in a way, I felt okay. My flashlight struggled to turn on, the glass was cracked, the rim was bent. I walked over to a log on the side of the trail and sat down to catch my breath. It is cold, my hands are turning blue. The pain from the wind chill replaced the pain of my hand. I'm okay with letting go. I was beginning to accept that even if I wanted to, I wasn't going to find my way out. I was alone. I was sitting on that log for what felt like hours, trying to find any strength in me to continue walking. The horns continued sounding. The screaming and yelling at a constant, echoing through the dense, frozen forest. I have run out of whiskey. I have run out of cigarettes. I am craving a cigarette more than ever. It has probably been hours. I heard a small thud, something hit my boot. I found a pack of Marlboro Reds. I opened it to find one cigarette and one lighter. I didn't question it, I lit the cigarette. The warm smoke filled my core. I looked up to see the tall robed figure had returned and was now sitting across the trail from me once again on a neighboring log.
"I'm proud of you, Forrest,"
said the slow, deep, broken, raspy voice. The figure got up and levitated slowly towards me.
"Fuck you,"
I said as I took another drag of my cigarette, looking down at my blood-soaked pants and boots. My flashlight finally has died. "Come," the voice said as it turned slowly to start down the trail. "What are you?" I asked as I looked up. "Come," the figure repeated. I got up, followed the figure down the trail. The dim glow from a lantern floated behind me. I had no choice but to follow the robed figure. I do not know what kind of cigarette the figure gave me, but no matter how long I smoked it, the cigarette stayed the same length and never went out. We walked through the dark, through the airy forest. Every now and again a body could be seen hanging from a tree. It was apparent that other figures could be seen floating through the trees. The large owl flew alongside us, periodically landing on tree branches ahead of us on the trail. Eventually, we made our way to a cobblestone entrance, with no lights, no markings, just another stone slab and candlelit walls with steps leading down it red.
"I, Aleph Lapadils Modaraklir. A promise one failed to keep, are left for others to sow to weep."
His voice sounded as the figure slowly began down the steps. It was steep. The steps went on for another mile until we reached a plateau. The tunnel walls transitioned to beautiful white marble. The floor was marble as well. Candles had become flame-lit lanterns with glass casings. This went on for a few hundred feet before opening to a beautiful colossal-sized hall. White pillars reached the ceilings. A fiddle could be heard faintly coming from a doorway opening in front of us. The glow from the red candles could be seen through the entryway. The floating lantern, the two large robed figures, the owl, and I all walked down the flame-lit pathway. The melody returned. This time multiple instruments played as we traveled. The air was growing extremely cold. The wind would grow more and more intense the further we traveled. After what felt like another mile, we walked down a few more steps and towards an opening that looked as if it led outside. The ground of the granite transitioned to solid ice, with a layer of very light snow. Once out of the pathway, I found myself on what looked like a frozen lake that continued for miles and miles. The snow was falling harder than I have ever seen. The wind was stronger than ever before. The horns were vibrating every bone in my body. We walked on the ice and into the frozen abyss. I looked at my watch once again. The time read 11:23 p.m. It was still December. My legs were cramping, my back was hurting. It was becoming harder and harder to walk. One figure about 50 feet ahead of us. One figure with me and the lantern still floating about 70 feet behind us. As we walked on the ice, I would look down now and again. I could see hundreds of people frozen deep into the ice. We started to pass people. People that were laying face down or people crawling on the surface. The ice and snow would pelt the backs of the people with such force. The men and women would belt in pain and agony. That is when we began to see hundreds of arms, legs, torsos, and heads, protruding from the surface of the ice. After a few miles of this, I began to see people that were frozen in place. Slowly blinking they stood frozen in place. Naked, motionless, and helpless. We would watch their faces as we walked by them. For the next few miles there was nothing. Nothing but a frozen, empty, nothingness. We walked further and further across the ice. I looked up after a long period of fighting the wind. I could see two flames in the distance. One larger than the other. The flames looked as if they were coming from large holes in the ice. When we got closer we could see that the flame was illuminating a titan-sized pine tree that stood hundreds of feet tall. Many large logs and stones circled the fire coming from the ice. The first robed figure walked over to the fire and stood next to it, then slowly turning around to wait for us. We walked around the pit, then found our seats. I sat with the two robed figures. Eventually, a large lantern slowly approached the fire pit and stayed by us for a few minutes before moving over to the large pine tree. The two robed figures were speaking in a different language. The same language on the slabs. The same language in Blanca's journal. I continued smoking the cigarette while they spoke. I stared off into the frozen abyss. The melody continued as the wind whistled past me. De Andre Venter med Kizran, Baylor I Selskap med de mest verd sat herring, said the shorter of the two figures. Du har gjort det bra Leonard. Du og vil bli her sammen med de andre til vi kommer tilbake. Responded the taller of the two. Du har en reise foran deg, Lurven Mintror du kroppen hans kommer til a ring reise? Responded the other robed figure. The one that has been walking with me slowly faces me, then back towards the other entity. Jeg gjør, Honor and Styrkungut. Vestkroppens Victor Ham, vil jeg la ham repot hoppen av en avoksin mine, det her en dipskam by harmatet gjør det mo forest. Men bail tranger gutten. Det vil være hyggelige ring sayet en familien plagendlik. Jeg tar gutten om nun oidlik, said the taller figure. It was like they were talking shit. I took another drag as my eyes stay fixed on a flickering glow from off in the distance. It was a very calming glow. Through the dark and through the foggy appearance of the cold abyss. The glow gave me a sense of comfort. A sense of solitude in such a quiet, desolate setting. I began to feel a hand on my shoulder. When I turned to see who it was, no one was there. Shortly after it began to feel as if someone were holding my hand. Their thumb rubbing back and forth across my thumb. I was in the company of something. At this point my mind and my body are so weak, I simply did not care what it was. I stayed fixed on the glow, smoking my cigarette. The wind that was whistling by almost started to sound like people singing in a calm tone. A female. The tone within the wind kept my thoughts subtle while I tried my best to keep my shit together. More tall robed figures could be seen far away, all drifting in the same direction. Some of these figures are very tall. One slowly passed the area we were resting. Its hood was not up. The figure was 15 feet tall with the head of a very large blackbird. Its beak is extremely long and narrow. I watched it drift towards the glow I've been fixed on. I began to feel as if there was a presence behind me. I turned around to find the flame-lit lantern hovering at least 5 feet off the ground. The frame of the lantern as well as the borders of the glass panels looked like a shining gold or yellow silver. The entire lantern looked fancy and from an era long ago. Almost medieval or from a Renaissance era of royalty and nobility. I had my broken flashlight and my empty flask beside me at the spot I was sitting. I watched the lantern slowly lower itself, then lightly tap the flask. The lantern then lifted itself back up, then drifted back over to the tree. The whole encounter was strange. I reached over and picked up the flask. It was now entirely full. I opened the lid and smelt the top. I had never smelt anything like it. It wasn't bad, but it did send chills up my spine. I put the flask to my mouth and took a swig. It was definitely alcohol. Something I've never had before, but I almost knew right away what it could be. Once I figured out it was moonshine, it became very clear what was holding that lantern. That was not just a floating lantern. Not just a floating lantern at all. I did not want to think too hard about it. So I continued to sip on the flask. I looked up into the large pine tree to see the giant owl looking off in the direction I was. It was watching the figures pass us as well. I'm almost sure this has something to do with December 25th. After a few long moments, I started to hear the figures speaking once again. Vi har nad reis perioden. Det par tid at jeg tar gutten til neste brand. Jeg har mia a ring snake med hamma om, han har mia a ring fa, said the taller figure as it stood up from the seat. Flame nor du for later den decade flammen. Jeg vil vale das andre derbort for a ring vant pod den retor sur zagen. Det der vi vil finsk jebnen til gutten. Responded the other figure. The robed entity that has been escorting me made its way over to me. It stood next to me, facing the glow I had been fixed on out across the dark frozen abyss.
next stop, my friend. It is a quiet place of rest for none other but yourself. As you know, today is a special day. The last hour before December 25th ends is called the time of travel. It is a period of time where 1 minute is the length of 12. This is so others have time to travel to where we are ultimately headed. Some are coming from across the world, my friend.
The figure explained. What happens after December 25th? I asked.
It is the start to a long and festive celebration all across the land. The Emperor receives the most worship on this day. It is also the day of celebration of everything wicked and unholy. On the 21st of December, the loyal and worthy people that worship the below and its demons receive their promises for their offerings. From December 26th to January 1st, the below will be in a period of festivities and cultural celebrations. All debt has been paid, all promises have been fulfilled. The Emperor is damning the last of the promised souls before it is time for festivities.
What do you mean by damning the last of the promised souls? I asked while taking another swig from the flask.
The period of travel, or what the below calls res periodum. It is a slow period of time where the Emperor consults with the kings, the high princes, and many other legion commanders. These noble leaders in the below do not reside in the below. They are not infernal. They are external like me, like Leonard, Yan, and Stolas. External kings and princes along with countless others from the below within the chain of command reside within the Landed Null. We all come here at certain times during the year for the Emperor. These daemons have traveled to bring balance to the lands they orchestrate or govern. With them, they carry a collection of souls that have deemed themselves worthy of having the Emperor decide the placement. These souls are presented as valuable due to the nature of the lives they lived and the way they had died. The large figures you see here are on their way to present the last of these promised souls to the Emperor so he can place them before the time of celebration. December 25th is the last day for all debts to be paid before the start of the new year.
The figure said before drifting slowly in front of me. What is going to happen to me? I asked.
I do not know, my Kaitanya. But that is why we are here. We will have time to converse further once we get to our next point in travel, but we must get going first.
The figure said as it continued to slowly drift away towards the glow. I got up from my seat and caught up to the figure. We were leaving the second robed figure in the levitating lantern at the fire pit. The large owl flew from the tree and over to us. When it landed in front of us, I noticed that there was a large, gold-pointed crown on top of the owl's head. This was not just an owl. I began to think of every time we say that owl. It followed us long before Willow Creek. Years and years the six of us in our friend group have seen this owl. I have seen this owl ever since I was taken to my grandparents. When it landed in front of us I could see it was the same owl but a lot bigger and now with a crown. The owl looked into my eye as the large robed figure and I walked past it. Shortly after it started flying above us, gliding through the wind while following the two of us. We continued traveling across the ice. We were walking into a cold and dark abyss, toward a dim yellow glow that seemed miles away. We were walking against the wind. Snow pelted my face as I continued to try and smoke the cigarette. It was not as loud as it was before. Although the wind and the singing were present, it was noticeably quiet. I think it is okay now to tell me your name, I said aloud.
You are right, my boy. My name is Zoggin. I am the second king of the Northridge Mountains. My true place of origin is in West Poland, but there was a native tribe that began to worship me within the forest of Northridge. The Emperor granted me travel to Northridge. It is there where I have made my land my own. I have been in Northridge for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Zoggin responded. It can't be just you. What else is in Northridge? What the fuck is that owl? I asked.
The owl's name is Stolas and is one of many noble princes of the below. You must treat him with respect. There are others. Many that I brought with me, others called upon by villagers or natives. Many being princes, dukes, earls, and marquises. It is not much benefit to explain who they are at this time. There are more important things to discuss at this moment, Zoggin stated.
Like what? I asked, trying to keep up.
The important thing, and the important one, is what I did not bring to the Northridge Mountains. There is another king that has made its presence known in Northridge. Its name is Bale. He is the first great king. He is the one you have been in wake of. He is higher on the chain of command than myself and others within the Northridge Mountains. He has a closer relationship with the Emperor than most within the below. He does not only hold power over the Northridge Mountains. He has control and power over the North. He governs the majority of the northern contents as well as the majority of the northern hemisphere. Baal as well as many others are in direct control of the cultures that worship the sun. Baal benefits greatly from sun worship, more than any other demons outside of the corridors. He is the influence of countless Nordic, Renaissance, and pagan cultures. He is the reason December 21st and June 21st have become what it has. Baal was granted travel to Northridge after something found a way to get its attention. That something was a very religious and vengeful spirit. A spirit that used to be a living person from a time long before your own. This spirit along with many others was promised heaven and all the benefits of being chosen by God. Some sins cannot be forgiven nor forgotten. The one that found your father lived a life of pedophilia and drug abuse. This spirit has killed, stolen, molested, stained, and humiliated other people. Most of his targets were not followers of the religion he practiced. As if this was his sick way of inflicting torment on those who did not convert. These spirits obviously do not go to the high heavens and have found a way to evade the below. Instead, spirits like this find themselves stuck, dead, and residing with the living. For whatever reason, they did not make it into heaven. This gives these entitled souls angry and vengeful intentions. Due to the fact that these people were very religious and knowledgeable about biblical facts and interpretation, they decide to answer the living when they are desperate for God. They then guide them to do horrid acts of crime and cruelty. A lot of these vengeful spirits and souls will guide others to call upon ones from the below simply to anger the Emperor and High Kings. That is how I got to Northridge.
I want to get this straight. Who called upon the first great king? Out of the entire northern hemisphere, why did the first great king travel to Northridge? I asked as I took another drag from the cigarette.
Your father did. The spirit that was influencing your father showed him how before abandoning him. He then traveled to Willow Creek to seek out the bishop. Your father received the king's attention after he found some book in some library that happened to be accurate. A book the spirit told him to look for. I am impressed how the series of events became lined in perfect harmony.
Ogden said with a small chuckle. What do you mean? I asked.
Your father was not only very lucky when finding that book, but he was also very unlucky. Another factor is how stupid the vengeful spirit was. It was the spirit that influenced your father to call upon the king. Your father thought he was calling upon an angel, but to his surprise, he found himself in wake of Baal. The first thing the king did was have the vengeful spirit pay for what he has done. The king returned to separate your father from his firstborn son, Jacob. In doing so, Baal got your father to promise him submission of life from everyone Mr. Bringston has ever touched. Including his bloodline, including Jacob. Including you. What that meant is that the king will give your father a newborn son, but only if the king was able to take to the below once his life is over. The king, your dad, is a pathetic, weak man. He knew that if your dad killed himself, the king would be able to extinguish an entire bloodline. Your bloodline is one of a Roman Catholic cardinal. I am well aware that no one has ever told you this, Forrest, but generations ago, your bloodline held a tremendous amount of power within the Catholic Church. A cardinal is very high on the chain of command. That vengeful entity was that exact cardinal. A cardinal that is part of your father's bloodline that did not get into heaven. A cardinal generations before your father that guided him seek out torment for anyone involved in Catholicism.
The figure said as we continued to travel. The owl flew closer to us only to glide back into the fog. What about the bishop? I asked.
The soul of the cardinal that influenced your father is also the soul that influenced the bishop. 1973 was the year that the bishop and your father died. It is also the year that Jacob took his life. The first great king is very powerful and is more of an entity than a figure or creature. He leaves an impression on everything he presents himself to. It is no coincidence they all died in 1973, and you were born in 1973. That was all due to Baal.
Zogan responded. I did not respond. I stayed silent and smoked my cigarette as we walked over the ice for miles. We eventually got to a point where I could make out a tall, black, cobblestone-like structure. The roofs all came to long points. The windows are thick and covered in frost. It looked like something out of the medieval era. The glow we were seeing is coming from the dozens of windows glowing from the candles within. Another large flame could be seen surfacing from a hole in the ice. The owl, Stolnus, glided over to the structure and landed on top of the pointed roof above the entrance. It watched us as we slowly approached. The horns sounded once again. The air was colder than I have ever felt before. The door was made of thick dense oak and was at least 10 feet tall. Zogan placed his hand on the wood. When he did, I could hear the metal in the keyhole turning, eventually unlocking the door. Zogan held it open as I walked by and into a very large living room. Zogan still had to lower his head while entering the doorway. Stolus stayed outside above the entrance, perched on the overhang. The inside was immaculate. Bare rugs on the floor. The walls clean and flawless. The fireplace was the largest I have ever seen. It was very warm inside. I'm not sure if it is a home or a resting stop, but the couches were very big and soft. Everything inside looked as if it were made for people twice our size. To my surprise, there were a few oak stepping stools by the entrance. I'm sure this is because there have been people before me that have come here. Zogan brought over 2 large mugs made of ox horns and bone. This is coffee. It is nothing to be afraid of, Zogan said as he handed it to me. He then sat down on the seat across from me. The fire to the side of us, oak bookshelves lined the walls. What is this place? It is beautiful, it is unexpected, I asked before taking a sip from the horn.
I thank you, my Kai Tanya. This place of rest belongs to me. It is one of many. I have one in almost every layer of the below as well as dozens within. Londa, of, Null. I have one in Merlot, one in the town of Nuthridge by your school, and my favorite one that is in the town of North Oak. The resting place in North Oak is where I stay the majority of nights,
responded Zogan. What are we doing here? I asked.
We have some time before we have to start our travels to the halls. You are here to rest your thoughts before your discernment, or what you call judgment. There is another reason why we are here, Forrest. It is time you and I have a conversation we should have had ages ago,
Zogan said as he brought the coffee mug up to the black abyss of his hood. What do you mean? I asked. Zogan took a long moment before he began.
Forrest, like I said before, I have been a part of the Northridge Mountains for a very long time. You and I are closer than you think. My Kai Tanya, your life, your timeline has many loose ends, and I'm sure you have buried your questions a long time ago, so we'd like to give you a few chapters to your story. I would like to talk about those chapters. It is important, Forrest,
he said. I'd like that. I'd like if you could tell me, I responded before taking a swig from the horn.
Your father died around the time you were born. As we know, he took his life in 1973. We also know Jacob died around that time in 1973. This truly destroyed your mother. Not only were Mrs. Bringston's thoughts and mental state seemingly disturbed or distorted, but Mrs. Bringston's soul was also seemingly disturbed and distorted. She was failing to thrive. She stopped eating, she stopped taking care of herself, and ultimately her condition and state of mind got so bad that she failed to take care of you, Forrest. You are aware that I am the true king of Northridge, so you must know that I bring balance to the land I govern. Know that I was there. I watched your mother go through things no person as pure as her should have to go through. Your mother did not deserve anything that happened to her. Just like your brother, your mother deserved a full and secure life with experience and love. Instead, your mother suffered a tremendous amount of pain that changed who she was forever. She did not ask for this, she did not deserve this. The first great king has no remorse and will do anything in his power to cause the most pain and torment to those who try to deceive him. It was me that took you from Mrs. Bringston and brought you to her mother and father. I am the one that brought you to your grandparents. Forrest, your fate had been decided from the moment you were born. Your life has always belonged to Baal, your life has always belonged to the below. My Kai Tanya, you are on borrowed time. You have been for 18 years. You have many people to give gratitude for this, but the reason you have lived for as long as you have is due to Jacob. If it was not for Jacob, Baal would have taken you a long time ago, and not only that, but you would have been placed right alongside your father. Baal did find Jacob. When he did, Jacob had the rope around his neck. It was in that room in Willow Creek where Jacob confronted Baal. Jacob did not want to suffer alongside his father once he died. So Baal told Jacob that if Jacob were to willingly take his life and accompany the king for 18 years, then he will not have to be placed with his father. Instead, He will be granted eternity in Londonov after the 18 years. Jacob agreed to this, but he said if he were to take his life, then that meant giving his baby broth, withholding UNTOLD to prove he was not worth the punishment of suffering with his father.
Zogan frenzied before another long pause. So Jacob kept me safe? I asked before taking another sip.
Jacob gave you time, myself and others kept an eye on you. You were given 18 winters, 18 midsummers and 18 midwinters. Unknowingly you had 18 witnessed years to give the below enough of a reason not to damn you, reasons to not suffer with your father.
Zogan responded. So why are you with me now? I asked before taking a drag from the cigarette.
I was given the honor of making sure you willingly face what is approaching us today. The first great king put myself in charge of bringing you to the emperor and for bringing you to him. I have also been given the responsibility of making sure you experienced every aspect of life you could until adulthood. That means the greatest moments, the saddest of moments, your strongest and your weakest moments were all moments I were there for. Unknowing to you, I watched you experience everything you could in the rawest of forms until the day you were forced to face your day of judgment. This way you can make your own decisions and truly prove to those watching that you were not intended for punishment but rather love and gracefulness.
Zogan said aloud before standing up and walking into a French-style kitchen, with a brick oven and hanging pots and pans. Bottles of wine could be found in an old oak cabinet with glass showing the collection.
Let's change it up a little, I will be choosing the year.
Zogan said from the other room.
This one is from 1619 my boy.
Zogan said as he picked up a bottle of wine. He then brought it over. He poured the two of us the red wine into our horn cups. I feel like there is more to this, my sir. Why else are we here? I asked. Zogan brought the horn to his hood once again after a long moment of silence.
You know what is coming for you, Forrest. You know what I am escorting you to. You must know that I will also benefit from tonight. If your bloodline ends tonight, the first great king will be relieved of any duty in the Northridge Mountains. Once the debt has reached its balance, Bale will be able to return to the Nordic region of the Great North, and the Northridge Mountains will be under my ruling for the first time in decades. I will once again govern North Oak and the mountains the town rests in.
Zogan said aloud. People suffered and people lost their lives because of me. People that I love, people that did not deserve any of this. Something as simple as withholding the truth caused others so much pain. If we are truthful about this, I did not tell my friends or anyone for my own benefit, and so I would not be alone while I answered the questions I had. In a way I am no better than anyone in my bloodline, I said as I tried not to cry in front of the king.
Forrest, listen to me. You do not give yourself credit for the good you have done. You should know by now that if you surround your thoughts with the intent of weakening yourself, if you constantly tell yourself you are weak, then that is what you will become. Well, my opinion, Forrest, you did very well, and you have a lot to be proud of. I will have you know that it is a responsibility I have placed on myself to make sure your judgment is balanced and fair. I will be there alongside Bale and many others as the Emperor deems your worth.
Zogan replied before we sat in silence once again. After a few moments, I took another sip from the horn and looked back up at the black-robed figure. What is going to happen to me, Zogan? I asked softly.
I do not know, my Tanya. That is in the hands of Bale, the Emperor and the others. I will have you know, I truly do not believe you deserve to be placed alongside your father. You have proven yourself of value in more ways than none, my Tanya. Right now I need you to get some rest. We will be leaving when you wake.
Zogan said before getting up from his seat and walking over to the front door.
You stay here, I will be outside this door.
He said before ducking his head to exit the structure. I laid down on the soft couch as I watched the fire's glow light the walls. Before I fell asleep, I found myself staring out the window. I could not stop thinking about Ashton. I could not stop thinking about Jacob and my friends. I fell asleep by the fire. The melody played in the wind, slightly muffled by the tall oak door. I woke up to Zogan walking through the entrance. This time he was carrying his staff. This time he was not wearing his hood on his robe. I was able to see Zogan's face for the first time. He had the head of a very large black bull or ox. The fur smooth and sleek. Easily the darkest shade of black I have ever seen. 2 very long bull horns protruding from the top of the head. His horns are beautiful. Even the deep scratches and gouges added a sense of beauty to them. In between the horns laid a large, pointed, gold crown. So vibrant, so elegant, so beautiful. When he spoke, his mouth did not move but his voice simply came from him. From the very bottom of the robe, a long black tail could be seen moving behind him. His tail is long if not longer than his body. The tail came to a point with fur and black feathers. He presented the confidence and stature of a god. As clearly and deeply as before, but putting the voice to Zogan made his presence that much more respected. Zogan stood up straight like a giant human. He walked like a giant human, and he spoke as a giant human. But his physical appearance was that of a beautiful, black, 15-foot-tall human bull. A bull with a glowing presence of royalty and nobility.
Come outside, my Tanya. It is time for us to begin the last part of our journey.
I walked alongside Zogan through the strongest of winds and over the coldest of ice. Stolas flew above us while we made our way towards the next glow. This one a lot more vibrant than the last 2. The horns sounded once again as the fog began to slowly lift. We traveled through the dark until we reached a spot where I could make out an almost castle-like structure. The castle was black and had hundreds of windows showing the candlelit ambience coming from inside. We could see other robed figures walking to the entrance of what looked like a kingdom of black granite and cobblestone. Flame torches lit the pathway for the last half-mile. Flame torches also mounted on the cobblestone exterior of the colossal castle. The doorway we were heading towards looked to be 30 if not 40 feet tall. As we walked towards it, I began to see people attached to chains all standing in a crooked line. As if they were all waiting their turn to go inside. Zogan kept walking, so I did as well. Stolas flew down to us and landed behind me. He walked with us as we entered the doorway. The inside of the castle was enormous. The ceilings are 30 feet tall. The open spaces are filled with the most valued possessions from every era going back until the beginning of time. Ones that humans have no clue about because they were never meant to be discovered. They belong here with the Emperor. Every room and hallway is decorated with tons of elegant gold and silver decor. The walls made of black granite and obsidian. Golds and yellow silvers bordered the floors and the ceilings. The air was warm. Dozens of flame lanterns line the walls. Flame lanterns that looked just like the one that follows my friends and I. There were large chandeliers made of diamonds and gold. In almost every room the ceilings and floors were also black granite or obsidian. Zogan led me down a long set of stairs and into a long hallway. He stopped once we reached a large oak door at the end of the hallway. Stolas stood beside me. Zogan took a lantern of the wall and handed it to me. He grabbed one for himself.
We're about to be in the presence of the Emperor, my Tanya. It is important you must not speak. You must follow everything I tell you to do. You must not run. You must follow commands, Forest.
Zogan said before turning around to open the door. I am scared, I am terrified. My body is shaking, my knees are weak. Zogan opened the door, revealing the entrance to a very large stone and ice circle pit. The walls made of polished black cobblestone. The ground was frozen solid once again. We were walking on ice. Ice that had people frozen within it. I followed Zogan across the ice and towards a collection of glowing flames about half a mile away. It was extremely foggy where we were. Dozens of glowing lights from dozens of other lanterns and torches could be seen making their way across the ice and through the dark abyss. Strong gusts of wind would hit my face every now and again. The horns were louder than ever. Once we got close enough, it became clear that the flames were in fact torches or candles, all held by doll-robed figures or creatures I have never seen before. These entities I was in the company of are unholy. They are wicked. They all belong to the below and sit at a noble place within the chain of command. Hidden in the black abyss and dense thick fog was the Emperor. He was as tall as a 5-story building, frozen from the hips down in the same frozen ground I was walking on. The fog was so thick, the Emperor was almost impossible to see. From what I saw, he has the body the size of a titan-sized human with some goat-like features such as ears, eyes and fur. He has both leather-like skin and thick long fur, both a black in color. He has a head with 3 faces. All faces are seemingly the same, with a stare as unholy as one could ever imagine. The horns atop his head were black and extremely elongated. They looked like that of a colossal-sized ibex or bighorn sheep. The Emperor has an aurora to him like no other. A voice so dark, so piercing. He did not look as I thought he would, and no one could prepare you for an encounter like this. I felt no pain, I felt no emotion, I felt no fear. It was silent. We stood from a distance, about 70 feet from the Emperor, for a few very long moments. Eventually, a very deep raspy voice sounded from the foggy abyss in front of us.
Taham, hit den, manlich bringa, ham hit.
Zogan motioned for us to start walking towards the Emperor.
He is calling for the first great king and he is calling for you,
said Zogan. I proceeded to walk forward until I stood before him. A large, flat slab of stone was at my feet. The sound of females singing faintly sounded again.
Dette Gutten Bale har förlovet segment, for Hanfram.
Sounded from the Emperor.
He has addressed you, Forest. He has addressed your day of judgment,
Zogan said before turning back towards the Emperor. Zogan began to speak.
Satanire, Jagdirdeg, Antonym, Bale, Harbed Tome.
Zogan said before a moment of long silence. The voice sounded from the Emperor once again.
En so vacker man, for en os harfaren. Till den unge hanen, till smusset sjalen. Till ver man zoon, bur sit blod, lufters ferget till Nimrod. Nimrod ma efslut denamanen.
Zogan explained what the Emperor said once again.
He has acknowledged the actions of your father. He has acknowledged the debt that is owed to the first great king.
There was a long moment of silence. While we were waiting for the Emperor to place his judgment, I could see the wings of the Emperor move back and forth a few times. The wings of Satan are like no other and have a span 3 times the size of himself. Every time that I felt wind in the corridors, I was feeling the Emperor moving his wings. That is what I tried to think about while the Emperor's faces looked into my eyes through the foggy abyss. The long moments of silence were agonizing. Said the Emperor in a very slow raspy voice. Zogan looked over at me slowly.
He orders you to place your head on the stone. He is ordering you to pay the debt to the king,
Zogan said as he slowly looked over towards me. We are now also in the company of the first great king.
Forest, you must walk over to the slab,
he explained. I was numb, I was exhausted from fear. After a few moments, I began walking towards the stone slab that lay before the Emperor. I brought myself to my knees and then got on my stomach. The stone slab was about 5 inches thick and about 7 feet long. I placed my head on the slab. The left side of my face to the stone. I could see a dim yellow glow through the fog coming from a flame torch one of the unholy was holding. The ambience was almost silent. After another few long moments, the Emperor began to speak again.
Jagber den forste store kongen. Bale. Kravet bedelingen for, gelden till ham. Denna samlingen vill fjärna, den första kongen. För all folkligt tals till Norddragnen. Zagen vill förbli, chef för Nordomrad. Ederet gelden, erbetalt. Bale kan du, komma av gjør upp kravetit.
Through the wind and through the silence I could hear the sound of what sounded like a dozen footsteps slowly approaching from behind me. My body felt empty and vacant of warmth, my face strained and cold. I could feel the floor of ice pressed against my chest. With my head to the side, placed on the slab like a pillow, I tried not to sob as I looked forward, terrified of what was approaching me.
Fight.
A tear ran down my face as I picked my head up from the slab. I then opened my mouth and brought it to the edge of the stone. My jaw opened, my tongue pressed against the edge. I could smell the dirt and the snow while pressing my teeth to the surface. I closed my eyes as my teeth scraped against the slab. The air grew tense to a point where my teeth scattered across the ice, brain tissue spilled out onto the slab. The foot that stomped the back of my skull came down with such force, not much of my head was left attached to my body. My jaw broke off from my head and flew 30 feet across the ice. The violin and musical horns came to an abrupt stop. The air was still. I felt motionless, but I was still able to see. I laid still on the slab. As I began, I could see many pairs of naked and bare human feet walking in front of my body. The footsteps all belonged to one figure. I tried moving my head and blinking. To my avail, I could lift my hand. After a few long moments, I was able to crawl from my mangled corpse. I sat a few feet from my body looking up at the giant figure. He had been watching me. He was staring back at me. He had around a dozen elongated human legs and feet that were all attached at the same point. The point where the legs melted together acted like a neck for three giant-like heads. One belonging to a frog, one belonging to a cat, and the other belonging to a human-like figure. A male with a blank, apathetic stare. The head about 10 times the size of my own. The head of the man was in the middle of the frog and the cat, all heads the same size. The head of the man wore a large pointed crown, just like Zogan and Stolnus, but taller and more intricate. Baal stood around 16 to 18 feet tall. He is undoubtedly wicked. He is unequivocally one of the rawest forms of an unholy entity. The king locked eyes with me for a few very long moments before he began to speak.
"We finally meet, my boy,"
he said slowly as I struggled to find any sense of balance. I looked up and nodded my head. I was not able to speak.
"Zogan will be taking you to London. You may leave the slab,"
said Baal before turning to walk into the fog and to the edge of the torched circle. After a few minutes, I stood up to see my corpse at my feet. The contents of my head had been scattered across the ice. My body lay lifeless. After the next horn sounded, I walked back over to Zogan. Shortly after the melody from the strings and piano returned, Zogan had removed his robe. His torso and arms were that of a giant human covered in black fur. His legs were that of a giant black bull. He had hooves for feet. He was covered in polished gold with a staff made of an actual giant's bone. His wings were that of an angel that expanded 3 times the height of himself. His mouth still did not speak when his voice was heard. Zogan was now accompanied by 2 very large black rams with very long black horns. They stood behind him while he faced the emperor. I walked over and stood next to him as we looked into the foggy abyss once again. We were waiting for the emperor to speak again. "You did well, my Catania," said Zogan.
"Jeghar Holtori Ahmed, Dake Helili Bay, Leelden 9. Monadai Bringston Generation Sfergats and Sheltil Baal. Hantak Levasid and Reagan Villia. Therefore Kunahanagagi Froseg Shalen Pa Reekdig Maid. Jacob, Lilybroren Willow Creekst Man. Ussa Hantak Sedagat Live. Do. Den Leeler den Nest to Hanan I Bringston Familia. Den Shell Till Horror Meg. Du Del Horror Meg. Du Drar Herfra. Du Comer Bear Dil Big Norjag Befuller. Permission.
"I'm sorry, Sir Zogan, I do not understand," I said aloud as I stared into the fog. I could vaguely see the silhouette of his wings once again.
I will tell you soon, little one. But right now we must go after I am granted permission to leave the Lord's presence,"
Zogan said as we waited for him to speak again. One of Zogan's black rams walked up to me and gently rubbed his horn against my head. It sniffed my hair before standing between Zogan and I, his fur brushing against me. I ran my fingers through the ram's fur as we waited for the emperor to speak.
Jeghar Gutnog Benin Han Samen Med Familia and Ogdiris Familia and Evagedai. Land of Null. Detter de Vilver Detent Deligats Var. Du Villica Kunis Gona and Onen Mensk Shell Pa Hundra Artil. Du Haryor Det Bra. Du Kan Gana.
Zogan took a step forward before he replied.
Heron Mentar Hamna,
Zogan said aloud.
Permission,
Replied the emperor. Zogan slowly turned towards Stolas, then turned around to walk from the Emperor. My body remains on the stone slab. I looked at it one last time before I turned to follow Zogan and Stolas. It did not feel cold anymore, I did not feel body pain anymore. I was no longer numb, I did not have a pulse. We walked up the black granite stairs and past the giant statues. The marble walls transitioned to black obsidian. The candlelight illuminated the stairs leading up. Stolas, the king, me, and the two black rams climbed the stairs until we reached the open frozen cavity. Zogan led us over the frozen ground as the wind howled past my head. The sounds of females singing returned. This time more vibrant and melodic. I was still covered in blood, I was still soaking wet from the journey. Zogan eventually put his robe back on. He also put his hood on again. His horns still protruded from the top of the hood. His face hidden in the abyss of the large hood, just like before. He held his bone staff to the ice and guided us through the snow and fog. Zogan called for Stolas to come over to him. "Stolas, my friend, I need you to fly to the resting point and tell Leonard and Yan we are on our way to them," Zogan said before Stolas leapt up from the ice and flew away toward the glow we were traveling towards. I am assuming it is the same cobblestone structure from before. Zogan, the rams, and I walked for miles across the ice. The sound of horns were still present, but not as loud as before. When I looked into the ice, I could still see people frozen under my feet. The melody continued to play as we made our way through the weather. We got closer and closer to the cobblestone structure. All I could think about is how warm it was inside, how soft that couch is, and how quiet it must be inside where the wind couldn't reach me. Is there a way I can wash off or wash my clothes once we get to the resting point? I asked Zogan. Zogan began to chuckle to himself.
Yes, my boy, I think you have earned yourself a wash before we continue. There is a hot spring in the back of the resting structure. You can wash your clothes and body in the hot spring.
Where are we going after the resting place? Where do you have to take me now? I asked curiously.
Forrest, I would like to stop for a moment, Zogan said with a small chuckle. What just happened to you was exactly what I was hoping for, and exactly what I was fighting for. You will not be going to any of the layers. You will be residing in the land of Null, or the land of no obligation, with me and under my watch. You have been gifted true freedom for eternity. I will explain land of Null at a later time. Maybe on our travels there. Baal, the Emperor and myself decided you have proven yourself undeserving of suffering with your father. Instead, you have been given praise and mounting respect, my boy. You have ended the stain of your bloodline. You have brought balance and answers to the children of the Willow Creek Institution. Your death will force investigators to look back into the history of the institution. This will eventually lead to many others involved around the time having to pay for their role. You have lifted the first great king of any obligation to the land of Northridge. Like I said before, I am once again the commander of the Northridge Mountains. This was the best thing to happen for you. You might not understand this now, but what you have done to pay the debt to Baal was a noble and respected act of honor and loyalty. You, my Kaitanya, will be a well-honored patron that will reside in Land of Null. Forrest, you have much to be proud of and much to celebrate. Over time many people within the Land of Null will know about this and give you honor and praise until the end of time. You will see what I am speaking of once we get there.
Zogan added. How do we get to Land of Null? I replied.
We have to travel back the way you came. The below has infinite entrances and pathways that all lead to where we met the Emperor. But remember that we are in the land of the unholy and the wicked. Think about it, Forrest. We are literally inside of hell. This land is home to what you would call wicked magic, alchemy and other unnatural occurrences. At this point nothing should surprise you, my boy, said Zogan.
How will I get there? It sounds a bit troubling, I replied.
I will be the one escorting you to Land of Null. You would not get far without me. Yan, Stolas, Leonard and I have been given the order to bring you back up. There are still entities that do not want you to leave the below, that are unaware of the meeting we had with the Emperor. They will try and keep you down here. There are ones in the below that do not obey orders and are wicked and unholy to their core. They will go out of their way to make you stay. If you were alone, you would not know where to go. You would undoubtedly get lost until something down here finds you. We have a very long journey ahead of us. It is my goal to get us to Land of Null by mid-morning. There will be a festival in North Oak we will be attending.
Zogan responded. We kept walking over the ice as the snow began to come down harder. The two black mountain rams walked behind us. I looked up from the ground to see how close we were to the cobblestone structure. From what I could see, we were about half a mile away at this point. I suddenly saw a small light emerge from the structure. It was moving fast and coming towards Zogan, and not long after, I heard yelling that was being muffled by the wind. The glow got bigger and bigger, meaning it was getting closer and closer. "What is that, Zogan, and why is it approaching so quickly?" I asked aloud. My heart began to race. "Why don't you go and find out?" Zogan replied as he stopped walking. He looked over at me as I kept walking towards the oncoming glow. I could see more small lights coming from the structure. The sound of footsteps racing across the ice got louder and louder. The approaching light was now 50 feet away from where I was.
"Forest!"
yelled Ashton before she ran into my arms. I fell back onto the ice. The lantern she was holding landing next to us. She straddled me and hugged me tighter than I have ever felt her do before. She began to cry as she struggled to get words from her mouth. I held her as tight as I could as we laid on the ice. We cried harder than we ever have before. "I am holding my Ashton again. I am holding my baby once again." Ashton kissed my face before kissing my lips over and over again. She held me for seemingly endless moments before we had a moment to look up towards the structure. 5 more lanterns quickly approaching us. The first was Jake, who dropped his lantern to lunge for me. He hugged me tightly on the ice while the others ran over to us. When I got up, I was met by Kendall, who embraced me immediately. When I pulled off of Kendall, I could see Ed and Taylor standing in front of me. A tear ran down Ed's face before he walked over to hug me. Once I pulled off, I hugged Taylor for a few long moments. When I pulled off, I looked at her in the eye and told her how sorry I was. She began to cry before reaching back out to hug me. There was not much to say. There was a feeling like no other. We were all crying and smiling as I embraced everybody one by one. Ashton walked over to me and wrapped her arms around me. She then looked at me in the eye and said,
"I love you."
I was looking into her eyes for the first time since she died. I told her I loved her too as tears ran from our faces. Zogan and his rams walked by us after we all stood up from the ice. Ashton lit 2 cigarettes in her mouth. She then took one out to place it between my lips.
"I am giving you a cigarette, my love. This one here's for you."
It felt so good to see her laugh once again. The 6 of us followed Zogan through the weather and over to the point of rest. The fire outside the cobblestone structure illuminated the walls. The windows once again showed the glow from the candles inside. Once we entered, I was met by a very tall and thin man. He was wearing the attire from the medieval era. He has a very long face with sharp pointed ears and a perfectly curled mustache. He has 3 very long horns that protruded from his head. A joker's hat rests between the 3 horns. The joker's hat has 5 small bells attached to it. The bells made a very faint jingle noise when he moved. Leonard seemed welcoming and almost friendly. He made it hard to remember he is one from the below and is as unholy as any entity or demon within it. He is very wise and cryptic in more ways than not. Deception and magic are where his nature defaults. Although there is much to question about Leonard, he made it clear he has the best intentions for me and the group. He was going to help guide us out of the layers and to the land of Null. Leonard has an energy to him that I really like. He spoke with a thick French accent and was always looking for laughs. After introductions with Leonard, I felt a tug on my jacket. I turned around to see Taylor. "Forrest, I want you to meet someone," she said. She grabbed my hand and led me over to the large couches. Even while sitting down, he was taller than I was. If I were to guess, Jan Gant White Ant stands at least 10 feet tall. I held my hand out to shake hands. "Hello Forrest, my name is Jan Gant Etan." He had a very firm grip and piercing eye contact. His skin was aged, his beard was long. He wore an old western hat. In his left hand, he held a large beautiful flame wick lantern. The one with beautiful glass and gold. "Nice to meet you, Jan," I said, still shaking his hand. "Nice to see you again, my boy," he said with a grin. Jan is rough. He has many scars on his face, bushy eyebrows, Jan's long beard, and thick mustache covered his mouth for the most part. He appeared like a human with subtle demonic features such as the tone of his voice or the stare he gives when simply listening. He wears a flannel under a large weathered jacket. Jan's fingers are very, very long. His hands weathered and dirty. His aura was almost that of an American Western mountaineer or cowboy from the 1890s. Jan is a friendly man but holds many eerie characteristics. He is forthcoming about who he is. Yan is relentless and has no issue giving karma to those who deserve it. In fact, karma is Yan Gandhi-tan's point of interest. Just like Leonard and just like Zogan, Yan Gandhi-tan also seeks a sense of balance within the living. Yan has a past and a history of getting down and dirty when he has to. Yan Gandhi-tan also has a special bond with Taylor. Yan Gandhi-tan mentioned a few times later in the night that until the end of time, Yan owes Taylor a debt that he will never be able to pay off. We were later told that Taylor made Yan promise that she and the ones that she loves will be safe and unharmed until the end of time. Yan has a dog. A giant black timber wolf that looks like Grim but twice the size and with orange eyes. Ashton turned and embraced me again. She wrapped her arms around me tightly as she pressed her forehead gently against my chest. My chin resting on the top of her head.
I thought I lost you,
she said softly. My love, I thought I lost you too, I replied.
I am so sorry you had to see that. I had no control. I want you to know I was there with you until you left for the Emperor. I stayed by your side every moment after I died. We were all with you up until you left that tree for the Emperor. They told us what was going to happen with you. We all knew what you were about to face. I am so proud of you, Forrest,
she said with tears in her eyes. When she picked her head off from my chest, I held her face and kissed her lips. I brought her back to my chest, then held her tightly again as I watched the others interact with Leonard and Yan. One by one, our friends would look over at us, then look over in the direction behind me towards Zogan. It wasn't long before they were all looking towards the kitchen with large smiles. Zogan called my name. Ashton nudged me to turn around. My mind went blank when I saw a boy standing to the right of Zogan between the kitchen and the doorway. Ashton looked up at me with a smile.
Go say hi.
I had no words. It was him. It was Jacob. He had a huge smile on his face. He wore thick charcoal gray pants with maroon suspenders. He had a long-sleeve button-up shirt tucked into his trousers. Jacob also wore a charcoal gray flat cap. One you would see a typical boy from the 1970s wear. He has the same nose as me, the same eyes like me, the same smile as me. I walked across the living room and over to him. I got down on one knee as he ran into my arms. Jacob began to cry, as I hugged him tightly. "How you doing, buddy?" I said softly as he braced me even harder. After a few moments, he pulled off of me, tears running down both our faces. "I am so sorry, big brother," he said. "My friend, you do not need to be sorry," I said before hugging him again. Ashton walked over to the two of us. Jacob pulled off of me and hugged Ashton. Jacob was still that of an 8-year-old boy. His voice, his posture, his maturity, his actions were all that of a young boy, but Jacob has been alive for 18 more years than I have. Jacob has been alive now for 26 years. He has the wisdom, the experience, the know-how of a 26-year-old. Jacob smokes cigarettes, Jacob drinks whiskey and wine. He reads long novels and can hold conversations with older men and women. He reminds me a lot of myself, he reminds me a lot of Mrs. Bringston. Zogan brought out 3 bottles of wine. Ashton and Leonard walked into the large kitchen and uncorked the bottles. They then poured themselves as well as 7 other glasses before walking over to the fireplace to hand them to everyone. It was easily the best wine that I have ever tasted in my life. I then walked over to our friends. Jake has his arm around Kendall. They both are laughing and look as if in a state of humbleness or peace. Kendall would kiss Jake's cheek every now and again as she used to when they first fell in love. Taylor sat next to Ed with her arm rested on his leg. Ed has his right arm around Taylor, the other holding his glass of wine. It was on that couch where I saw them kiss for the first time. Taylor has never looked so happy, and the same with Ed. We all knew since we were kids that they were soulmates. It brought me a sense of solitude to see them together like this. I spent some time with them before I felt it was time to wash off. I stood in a smile pool of blood and other fluids that the melting ice brought with it to my feet. The fluids on my body belonged to some of my friends in this room. It felt a little uneasy knowing that I knew this and the others did not. Ashton and I walked over to the kitchen to where Zogan was standing. "I would like to wash off now," I said aloud as I looked into the abyss of his large black hood. Zogan's head slowly turned to Ashton, then slowly nodded. He then looked over to the hallway behind us. "Ashton, you and Forrest may go wash in the hot spring. You may bring a bottle of wine with you. Once you have rested, we will depart for the corridors. Take your time, and clear your head the best you can. You have done well, my boy." Ashton then took my hand with a smile and walked me down the hallway. The walls illuminated by red candles. We reached another oak door at the end of the hallway. Ashton opened up the door, I walked through first. She shut the heavy door behind us and grabbed my hand to lead us again. We were now outside but walking under an overhang along with the building. Candles continued to light the walkway. We followed the path away from the house and over to another smaller stone-like structure. Flame torches on both sides of another oak doorway. The walls are black cobblestone. The ceiling was made of thick pane glass that had gold trim. The glass ceiling came to a pitched point over the center of the U-shaped room. The large opening in the structure displayed view into miles of open nothingness. You could see dozens of small glows coming from torches in the distance. The torches slowly moving across the frozen abyss. There was enough ambient light to create a rather beautiful scene. I walked a little further into the colossal open room. The floor was black stone and was warm to the touch. There were a few small sets of stairs that lead to a platform in the center. The platform was home to a very large rock hot spring. At least 20 feet wide, the outside is solid rock. Steam arose from the surface of the water. Torches mounted surrounding the outside of the rock. The place we are in is quiet and rather beautiful. I followed Ashton up the steps and over to the spring. We walked along the edge and over to one of many small columns about hip height. An old record player sat atop one of them. Ashton placed the wine and glasses on top of a column, then walked over to the record player. She dropped the needle on the record that lay already spinning. The record was labeled Dette Flight and Bendette. A soft piano and cello sounded while Ashton poured us wine. The glass ceiling kept the snow from falling on the two of us and created an almost safe-like feeling. I was amazed that I could still taste wine. I did not feel cold anymore, but there were times I could feel warmth. Whether that be a cup of coffee or a hug, a sense of warmth came with it. I did not feel hungry or the need to sleep. I knew we were dead, but I did not know I would still be able to feel some things. I figured I would be numb to everything. I feel love, I feel comfort, I can feel happy. The majority of the emotions I felt before, such as anxiousness, worry and sadness, were nowhere close to as strong as they once were. Negative emotions were no longer distracting. Ashton removed her clothes and brought over the 2 glasses of wine. The glow from the torches and candles lit up random parts of her naked body as she approached.
"Hold this for me,"
she said softly as she handed me the bottle and my glass of wine. She smiled as she began to unbutton my shirt and pants. She knew I wanted to touch her, but she made it so I could not by having me hold 2 things at once. One by one she threw my clothes into the hot spring. We both stood naked, our feet on the porous rock border. I placed the bottle of wine on the edge of the rock and lit 2 cigarettes. We got into the water and sat down on the carved-out stone ledge. We both looked out into the frozen abyss while the music played softly behind us. There were a few more flames floating over the ice, carried by figures off in the distance.
"Where are they going?"
Ashton asked as she brought her wine glass to her lips. "They are traveling back to where they came from, my love. There are thousands of entrances to the layers, but they all lead here. That glow you see are figures of the below carrying torches. They are all returning to the land they govern. Some of those figures have days, even weeks of travel ahead of them. According to Zogan, we have a little over a day of travel," I responded. Under the water I placed my hand on the inside of her leg, my small finger resting next to her vagina. Immediately I felt a disturbance in the force. I now have a boner. I was surprised and relieved that I am able to achieve such a boner. I am just glad there is a chance I'll be able to enjoy sex again. We both laughed as she got up to sit on me. We spent a few more moments watching the glowing flames float across the ice. I broke the silence. "Baby? Look at me," I said slowly. Ashton looked over. She then took a drag from her cigarette followed by a smile.
"What's on your mind?"
she said softly. I had us all killed, Ashton. I cannot help but to be overwhelmed with guilt and disgust for myself. Everyone is smiling, everyone seems happy, but we're all dead. The life we all had is gone. They did not ask for this, you did not ask for this, I said looking up at her.
"We know. I know. We forgive you. I forgive you." Telling them what you knew is not a guaranteed way of preventing all of us from losing our lives. Leonard explained to us that if it were not for this, then none of us would see each other again, and for that I am grateful. Seeing you makes that life worth it. Our friends back there know how fortunate we are to all be with one another, and we also know if it were not for you, we would all be separated and left to endure torment here in the below.
I don't know what lies ahead of us, I do not know what our future holds, I replied.
And that is okay, my love.
she responded.
We have until the end of time to figure all of this out. We have no obligations, we have no burdens, we will not age, we do not have to worry about health. Forrest, we do not have anything left to worry about. Now I have been dead for a few more days than you. This will all take a while to sink in, but you will feel what I am telling you,
she said before kissing me. I sat back and took a deep breath. When I did, I felt that warmth return to my stomach and chest. I sat with Ashton as the weight of it all began to lift. She continued to help me realize what this all meant and the things we no longer have to think about. She then helped wash me of the blood left in my hair and on my face. We grabbed my clothes as they floated by. We rinsed them multiple times before squeezing the water from them. We then laid them out to dry by one of the torches. We both sat naked on a stone outside the water. We drank our wine and smoked our cigarettes as we waited to be dry. Once we dressed ourselves and began our walk back to the main structure. Before opening the last oak door to the living room, Ashton stopped me. "I love you," she said before kissing me. "I love you too," I replied. "They are going to keep us safe down here, remember that, okay?" she said quietly. I nodded before she opened the door. Jake, Ed, and Jacob were picking up the rest of the gear into one of 3 backpacks that lay next to the front door. Apparently, Jan and Leonard collected what we dropped when following us through the corridors. I grabbed a large jacket that Jake had pulled out for me. Ashton put on her boots and coat while Jan put out the fire. We were all ready to start our journey. We were all told to grab a lantern from the wall. Jan explained that these flames will never go out, but you must never lose the lantern. It will be our only source of light in some parts of our travel. One by one we all piled outside the structure. Leonard and Ed took their time making sure that we had everything we needed. The rest of us, including Jacob, stood in a group on the ice. We lit our cigarettes and waited for everyone to be ready. And everyone hugged me once again and told me how proud of me they were. Taylor said that the majority of them were there when I went to Mr. Bringston's shack. Jake said he was the one that placed the Zippo on the dresser. After some conversation, Ashton and I broke off from the group and walked over to a torch that was impaled in the ice. We were facing the direction we were about to travel towards. A giant frozen, dark, foggy abyss. Miles and miles of frozen ground. We stood in silence to absorb the ambience. A sense of solitude could be felt with the melody. How beautiful it is. Leonard explained that we must all stay close. There are things within these layers that will seek us out and take us if we are away from the others. We all nodded in agreement and started our way into the frozen abyss. Zoggen's 2 large ox lead the way in the front. They both had lanterns hanging from each of their horns. This was so we could all see the terrain ahead of them. Behind the 2 oxes Zoggen. He held a large lantern in his staff made of giant bone. Behind Zoggen was Ashton and I. Behind us was Leonard, then Jake and Kendall. Behind Jake and Kendall was Jan's dog, Blue. Behind Blue was Ed and Taylor. In the back was Jan Gandhi Dan with his lantern. We were told that the pathway gets narrow, and for a lot of our journey, we will be walking along the edge of colossal-sized pits and over bridges where we have to walk in a line. There will be other times we can all walk alongside one another. It all depends on the terrain. The wind was howling, the melody returned and could be heard from the abyss. The ground is the same frozen solid ice as before. When brushing away the snow from the surface, you could see hundreds of people frozen at different depths. The horns began to sound again. The snow was falling harder. We were walking with the wind, which made everything a little easier. After a few long minutes, I turned around to see the stone structure and its lights fading in the distance. The surrounding light was growing darker. We have a long journey ahead of us. Our time of travel has begun. Our group tried not to stay too far from each other, so we were still able to hold conversations and pass the bottle back and forth through the weather. The sounds that were creating the melody got closer and louder. At one point Kendall pointed towards a group of glowing lights drifting over the frozen landscape. Leonard looked over at us with a smile, then whistled in a short rhythm. The glowing light stopped, then started drifting closer to us. The glow was coming from more lanterns. This time held by multiple dark figures. The lanterns were attached to instruments that were levitating above the ground. Long arms protruded from them to play them. One was a cello. The cello was twice the normal size of a normal cello. 3 long arms with long fingers came from the sides and reached over to pluck the strings. One hand held a bow. The next instrument was a violin with 2 long arms and a cast iron pole attached at the bottom that housed a dimly lit light bulb. The next was a large rib cage that looked like it belonged to a giant. Drums and cymbals of all shapes and sizes looked to be attached to the ribs. 5 long arms reached out to play these drums. Other instruments were hidden by the dark. The floating band had personality and was somewhat interactive. They all floated beside us playing melodies while we walked over the ice. Leonard kept us pretty entertained by doing impressions of famous people from our lifetime. He could do many accents. His favorite was an English philosopher. He spoke in this voice for a while, making jokes. The floating band began to synchronize and play what sounded like a song. Ashton looked over at Leonard and asked,
"Why have the living been so misguided? Why can't they all believe one thing so they can all receive the same outcome? Is this the end?"
Leonard responded in the philosopher English accent.
I suppose we have 2 dominant ideas about what happens to us when we die. There's the old-fashioned idea that after we die we go to another world. I say old-fashioned, not to say it's out of date. We don't know what the answer to this is. But that's the traditional answer of the Western world. When you die, you go to another life. Maybe heaven, maybe purgatory, maybe hell, who knows? I think nowadays, though, the more general idea, the more plausible idea to many people, is that when we die, we just cease to be. That's all there is to it. But we're inclined, I think, to have in our minds a picture of this, which indeed is depressing, of being shut up in the dark for always and always and always, to be kind of buried alive in a blackness, where we are blind, deaf and dumb. But it seems to me that the fascinating thing about this is that although a particular set of memories vanishes, death is not the end of consciousness.